I'm going
Thank
to
you.
get ready to share my screen. Today, we're going to be talking about the buyer rep agreement or the BRBC. We're also going to talk about the notice of broker involved properties, and we're going to talk about the cancellation of buyer representation as well. So I'm going to get into all of that. I am going to have it be a little bit interactive, or at least I'm hoping to have it be a little bit interactive. And so let me share my screen. Let me get to the right form. So first of all, the BRBC, if you're not aware, the newest version of this form came out just about a year ago, December of 2022, and it actually replaced a couple of different forms. So with this form, like we have the option, for example, of having an exclusive agreement or a non-exclusive agreement. And in the past, that would have been two different forms, depending on which one you wanted, and then they combined it all into one form. As with most of our contracts, when we have them sign the BRBC, there's also going to be some other disclosures and forms that are automatically attached to that, and we want to have them sign those as well. So for example, this form right here, which is the agency disclosure form, they might actually sign this more than once because they'll sign it when they sign the RPA as well.
Mhm.
And if they put in multiple offers, they'll sign it multiple times, and that's okay. But so the first form just discusses agency relationship. And actually, that's the first form that you should ever have anybody sign. They should not sign any other form before they sign this one with you. Then we have the fair housing and discriminatory advisory. Then we have the possible representation of more than one buyer or seller. And we have the wire fraud advisory. And then we get into the form that we're here for today. Okay. And so, like Ernie said, when we present this to our clients, we want to just present it matter of fact. It's not like this big thing that we're having them sign. It's just, okay, here's the next step. Go ahead and sign this, and then I can get to work helping you find your house. On the buyer representation agreement, one of the things that you'll see is that it has a beginning date. So let's say I begin it today. And then our ending date on just about every other form that we have is an actual date. On this one, they've done it differently, and so it's number of days. So are we going to do it 30 days, 60 days, 90 days? You know, if you have somebody that's resistant to signing it and maybe they don't know what it's like to work with you, maybe we do it for 2 weeks and then we extend that out if we need to. So we have some options here, but it's a little bit unusual than in any other form. And then, excuse me, one of the things that you'll notice here is that it is a non-exclusive right to represent them. If we want it to be an exclusive right, then we're going to check a box a little bit down on the form. But if we don't check that box, then it automatically defaults to being non-exclusive. And I'll talk about what that means in just a second. Having them sign this form gives us the opportunity to ask them if they already have an agreement with another agent or another broker. And that's good to know because we don't want to put a whole bunch of time and effort into a client that's already contractually obligated to another broker or agent. And ultimately what that would do, depending on the type of agreement you have, is commit them to possibly working with and owing a commission to more than one agent. And so this gives us an opportunity to just double check with them and make sure they don't have an agreement with anyone else. And then we come down to the property. What property are we going to help them find? And we have different options. We do not need to fill out every single one of these lines, but are we helping them find a property in one specific city or cities? Is it maybe a county that we're helping them find a property in? What price range are we helping them find it in? And we want to be here. We don't want to be too restrictive to where we're not covering all the different properties that they might be looking for. But we also don't want to be too open on it because if we're too open, it could later be determined that it's not a valid agreement because it was too vague, right? So we're not going to put anywhere in the United States, right? That's going to probably be too vague, but we might do the county or a couple of counties depending on where we're located. I've seen it be done the state of California. I don't know if that's too vague or not. Maybe talk to your broker, but there's, maybe it's Northern California, Central California. But then again, what's the definition of Northern and Central? So just when you're filling it out, even on price range, I do like to keep this a little bit open. For example, I had a client that was looking for a $500,000 horse property in Tulare County and ended up purchasing a 25,000 piece of vacant land in the county south of us. So sometimes, you don't know what ultimately they're going to be looking for. We can specify specific properties. And so maybe if we are working with somebody and they are purchasing a for sale by owner, for example, and we're only going to possibly represent them for that one property, we might put a specific property address or whatever the case might be. Okay, so then we come down to the fun part. Then we come down to compensation. So this is where we are identifying how much you're going to get paid by helping this buyer, right? And we can have that as a percentage. So this can be whatever percentage you want it to be. Typically, we might see 2.5%, 3%, whatever is common for you and for your business. There is a place to put and.
Man.
What's that, Aaron?
3%.
3%, yeah. And so, and I hesitate to put a specific number out there just because with the whole, lawsuits and all of that. Mm-hmm. But yeah, whatever percent works for you and your business is what you want to put there. And then you can also put a flat dollar amount here if you want as well. Or so it can be like a percentage and a dollar amount, or it can be just a dollar amount. Or it can be pursuant to a compensation schedule that would be attached. And so, for example, I was helping an agent the other day. Their client was looking at a piece of vacant land. It was $15,000. I think it was $15,000 for the entire piece of land with a 3% commission. So if we put up here 3%, it sounds like, oh, great, 3%. I've got a really good commission amount coming in. But when it's 3% of 15,000, it's like, so you might also want to put, a flat dollar amount in that case as well. Okay, so then here's the question. When does the broker get compensated? The broker is entitled to compensation right here on 4B. The broker shall be entitled to compensation specified in paragraph 4A, so whatever percentage that, or dollar amount that was. If during the representation period, so however many days that this is good for, or any extension thereof, if the buyer enters into agreement to either purchase, lease, or otherwise acquire property that we've described up here in section 3, and they complete the transaction or are prevented from doing so by default of the buyer. Now, let me say one thing here. While we're talking about how to fill this form out, there's a lot of different viewpoints on it. So I've always considered this to be like a loyalty agreement, and different brokers might have different opinions on this. So make sure you check with your broker. But my broker, as far as I know, isn't going to go after somebody on this agreement. And so it's here more for loyalty. So we run businesses that are reputation based. And if we earn that reputation of we're going after people when we're not even helping them and it's gone south and all of that, that could hurt us more than the few $1,000s that we might get off of that one deal, right? So you've got to keep that in mind as well. At the end of the day, are we really going to pursue a buyer for the commission? And we're in a changing world right now. So what it looks like today as far as compensation might not be what it looks like in the future. And so these are just things to think about, and maybe have discussions with your broker about. I'm not giving you, a specific answer here, just kind of giving you some things to think about. But as far as the compensation, so the broker earns the compensation when they either complete a deal or are prevented from completing that deal by the buyer themselves. As I mentioned earlier, the agreement is non-exclusive. And so a non-exclusive agreement means that while I'm helping this buyer, there might be an agent over here that's also helping that same buyer. And it's all good because that's the agreement that we have. The alternative to that is to have an exclusive agreement, and in an exclusive agreement, I am the only one that's helping that buyer. If somebody else helps that buyer, well, guess what? That buyer still owes me the compensation because we are in an exclusive agreement. And so whether you choose to do non-exclusive or exclusive would be up to you and possibly your broker. But at this point, it's kind of a business choice on how you do it. Now, we're talking about broker involvement. So what does that mean? How do we know whether a broker was actually involved or not? And there are four right here in paragraph 4B1. It identifies the four ways that a broker would be seen as being involved. So one is the buyer physically entered and was shown the property by the broker. Number two, the broker showed the property to the buyer virtually. Now, that doesn't mean that I sent them a link to a house and they clicked on it, right? That's not what that means. It would have to have more involvement than that. And maybe that's like a video tour that we've done. Or number three, the broker submitted a signed written offer from the buyer. Or number four, the property was introduced to the buyer by the broker, or one for which broker acted on buyer's behalf. What it says here, though, is that merely sending the buyer a list of properties shall not be deemed broker involvement without documented action on the part of the broker where it shows that you analyzed that property or assisted them in another way. Could be communicating with the seller or the seller's agent regarding the buyer's potential purchase of the property. So these aren't written in stone, like there could be like gray areas on some of this, but these are the guidelines that we have as far as what it means for the broker to be involved. Are there any questions or thoughts on that? Pretty straightforward, right? Okay.
Yeah.
So that would be for the default, because there's no check to box, no box to check or anything right here, so non-exclusive. But if we want it to be exclusive, then we would need to check this box right here. And in that case, then the agreement, it says it's exclusive and irrevocable. Broker will devote time and resources to assist this buyer in finding and acquiring the property with the expectation of being paid for their services. And this is what I was saying earlier. Broker is entitled to compensation if buyer acquires property during the representation period with or without the broker involvement, even if another broker is also entitled to be paid. And so up here at the top, where we ask number two, where we're asking them if they have a pre-existing buyer rep agreement with another broker, if they do, and we don't know about it, and that agreement happens to be a exclusive representation, at the end of the day, the other broker might contractually be obligated to the commission that we think that we're going to be getting. And so things can get really messy if we're not asking those questions up front to know whether or not we are the only one representing this client.
Well, so on this, on both, if you even if the non-exclusive or exclusive, you should be do your due diligence on which properties that you presented to your buyer and which ones you actually showed and talked about.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Because even on the non-exclusive, at least we know there's another agent that could be involved. But what if that both agents show them the same house? You're still kind of in that same predicament, right?
Well, but because you could walk and go show 3 or 4 properties to in one day with your buyer, and then turn around and go back to see it with their family member, and the seller's agent talk them into just working with them, and then you're screwed if you don't have any agreement. So
Mhm.
documented the fact that you showed these properties those days, and then they went back and tried to buy it. And I mean, I surely would try to get a hand in it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, but just, as with anything in real estate and working with clients and customer service, like communication is key. So we just want to make sure that we're, communicating. We know what's going on. We know what they're seeing. We know whether we're exclusive or not exclusive. And they know that too. So it's not a matter of just putting this form in front of them and having them sign it. We want to know that they understand what it means that they signed, whether we're exclusive or not exclusive, right? Okay. And then they're also identifying the buyer just so there's not any try to work around. The buyer includes any person or entity related to buyer or who in any manner acts on buyer's behalf to acquire the property. So I can't have the agreement and then go have my husband buy it when he's buying it for me to try to get out of this agreement. So that's what that's saying right there. Okay. So when we get into an agreement with a buyer, it's a two-way agreement, right? So they're committed to us, but we're also committed to them. And I don't know if you've ever had a buyer that you have decided that, you just wish you weren't working with them. Sometimes that, sometimes that happens on both sides of the thing. Sometimes personalities don't mesh. But there are ways to cancel the agreement, and the cancellation will vary depending on what type of agreement we have. And so this is saying that either the buyer or the broker can cancel the agreement, but it has to be by giving written notice to the other party. So it has to be written. The agreement will be terminated differently depending on whether it's an exclusive agreement or a non-exclusive agreement. So right here, if it's an exclusive agreement, then it either terminates upon receipt or upon receipt of the written cancellation or certain number of days after that. And so while we're having them sign this form, we are determining if this gets canceled, are we allowing it to cancel immediately or a certain number of days after? And that's up to you guys what you want to do. I like the idea of having at least a couple days notice, but I guess it probably doesn't really matter either way. But if it's an exclusive agreement, then it automatically says that it cancels 30 days after receipt of the notice. And then it says
An automatic
broker
default, even if you don't check that box.
automatically, yeah, 30 days.
Yeah.
If it's an exclusive agreement. So non-exclusive is immediately or whatever number of days we decide, and exclusive is 30 days after receipt of the notice.
Got it.
And then it says broker shall be entitled to compensation if during the representation period, buyer acquires property for which there was broker involvement. Again, we have the definition of the broker involvement. Provided the broker delivers to the buyer a written list of those properties for which there was broker involvement. So I'm going to show you guys that form in a minute. So it's not just good enough that we showed them this house and or even wrote an offer on the house that wasn't accepted. And we all know that we have to actually claim those properties by giving them written notice. And generally speaking, we have 5 calendar days. So even if it's a weekend or a holiday, it still counts. 5 calendar days after the effective date of the cancellation to give them that list of the properties that we have broker involvement for. And then we have this other option here, C2. So if it's an exclusive agreement and we check this box, then neither party shall have the right to cancel this agreement prior to expiration except by mutual agreement. So right now, the way it works is if somebody wants to cancel this agreement, either the broker can decide, you know what, I want to cancel it, or the buyer can decide, you know what, I want to cancel it. This is saying that the only way, if we have an exclusive agreement and we check this box, that we can cancel is if both parties mutually agree. So there are ramifications of checking the box or not checking the box. And so that's something that, again, you might discuss with your broker, see how they want you to handle it. But just know that meanings of things change depending on what's marked or not marked, right? Okay. And so we'll talk about the cancellation in just a second. I just have a couple more things that I want to talk about on this particular form. So accounting for payments to brokers by others. So up at the top, we got to determine how much we were going to, essentially charge. So just for example purposes here, let's say we wrote that at 2.5%. So we want the buyer to compensate us 2.5%. And usually, at least right now, the seller will be the one that compensates us, not the buyer. But for purposes of the language in the contract, if we have it written that the buyer is going to compensate us 2.5%, what happens if we only get 2% from the seller? So buyers contractually up.
You have to negotiate the other 5% with the seller, or the buyer's responsible for it.
But yeah, that 0.5%.
Mm-hmm.
So we can negotiate it and see if the seller will pay it. And there's actually a place on the purchase agreement or the RPA where we can mark a box, and that automatically, and we have to submit a copy of the form, but basically ask the seller to pay that extra 0.5%. We could just do away with the 0.5%. We're willing to take whatever is being offered from the seller. And if it's 0.5% less, that's fine. I'm still getting paid by the seller. It's all good. Buyer, you don't owe anything else. Or we could take what the seller's giving us and have the buyer pay us that extra 0.5%, right? So those are the options. But what happens if we are at 2.5% agreement with the buyer and the listing side is paying 3%? So now there's an extra 0.5%. What happens with that?
You better have that box checked right there, or else it goes to the buyer, or the seller keeps it.
So by default, it automatically pays to the broker.
To the broker.
Yes. If we check this box, then it would be credited to the buyer. So then essentially at the close of escrow, the buyer would get that extra 0.5% instead of us if we check this box.
Oh, okay.
Or we could do something other. Maybe it gets split 50-50. Maybe it gets donated to charity, like whatever it is. But we have options. And so that's what we want to make sure that we know, that if we're putting a certain percentage up at the top, what happens if it doesn't match that percentage? And again, most brokers aren't going to want to go after buyers for additional amounts. But I guess depending on the situation, your broker would make that decision, you and your broker. Okay. And then
I got confused on that because there was issues on crediting the buyer for extra compensation in the deal. So you have to check the box for that if you credit the buyer towards it.
Okay. So it was like the opposite.
So it automatically goes to the broker if you don't check anything.
If you don't check the box in this right here. Okay. Yeah. And then this number 3, D3 right here. So this is that box I was talking about on the RPA that allows the offer to ask the seller's agent or the seller to compensate for whatever amount might be missing, whatever difference there might be between what's agreed to in this form and what's being offered on the MLS. And so checking box, well, right here, the buyer authorizes or does not authorize broker to include a term in the buyer's offer obligating seller to pay broker directly or through escrow for any compensation that buyer owes broker. So it automatically defaults to you being authorized. But if you're submitting an offer for your client, you don't want to just check that box. You want to make sure that they're okay, that you're checking that box, because that could affect the, their offer, right? Because that's 0.5% or whatever that the seller would be getting taken off of his bottom line, his or her bottom line. Okay. Is that pretty clear to you guys?
I have a question.
Yes.
We're talking Hi, Lori. Hi,
Hi.
everyone. Yes, I just got into. Um, I have a question. Like, it is written publicly. Like, I mean, is able. We are able to see that the seller is offering 2.5%. Let's say, but we wrote um an exclusive. Are we talking about the exclusive
Yeah,
uh,
we're talking about
representation
the buyer
agreement?
rep agreement.
Okay, so I remember that there was somewhere that either 2.5% or whatever is offered. I don't know if that what is offered in the contract is offered by the seller to the buyer's agent. Uh,
See, so
are we talking about
can you
that?
write that in up there or anywhere, just write it in saying what, whatever seller offers, like this agreement, broker gets paid whatever seller offers.
Yeah.
You could probably put that in other.
So is that what you're talking about, Rafina?
Yes, yes, yes.
Yeah.
Because like now I see that we're dealing with that we're doing this buyer's representation, and I remember that there was somewhere some not 2.5%, but whatever is offered
Mm.
by the seller, or because
mhm.
it doesn't depend on the buyer, so that we don't deal with this half plus, I mean 1% plus or 0.5% plus or less, so that the buyer, or I don't know if this is different from what I.
So my recommendation would be to talk to your broker and ask them how they would like you to approach that.
Mhm.
Okay, good.
So,
Yeah.
so what I'm doing here is just explaining the form and the different options on the form. And
Yes.
ultimately, I want you guys to talk, know what your broker wants you to do in regards to this form.
Yes.
Because what's going on now, I mean, I haven't seen it yet, but I've heard that there's actually people in the MLS right now putting 0% compensation, buyer
Mm,
compensation.
yeah.
So this is why this is so
Oh, okay.
prevalent, and why we're going through this is because you got to get paid, you know.
Yes.
Yeah.
But I mean, if they go and find, if you present a house, or you got a client that's interested in this house, and in the MLS it says only 1% or only 0%, then they're expecting the buyer to pay their own commission, so that if you don't fill this out, you're going to do all this work and not get paid at all.
Yeah.
Okay.
So that's why that's why they changed it to the BRBC. They
Oh.
added that BC, buyer compensation. Before it was just an exclusive buyer agreement and with no compensation.
And
Okay.
Rafina, I think that as time goes on, you'll start seeing this form more and more used by agents just because of the changing environment that we're in.
Yeah,
Okay.
that's
Okay.
why like I said, our brokerage is making us do it. They specifically want us,
Yes.
you know.
To pay
To be doing it.
attention
Yeah.
to this.
Okay, so let's move
Okay.
on because I
Thank
want
you.
to finish this and then get to the other two forms that I want to show you. So, additional broker right to compensation. So, this is going to come up in another form, and so I just want to point it out here. So, broker shall be entitled to the compensation provided, agreed to up above, if within so many calendar days after expiration of this agreement, there I lost my line here just a second. Um, if buyer enters into an agreement to acquire property for which there was broker involvement prior to the expiration of this agreement. So what this is saying is that if I showed you or had broker involvement in these 5 houses, our agreement expired. What I'm saying here is that if you go buy one of those houses within so many days after our agreement expired, I'm still eligible for that compensation because I showed you those properties or had broker involvement while we were under contract. And so you would need to put a number of days in here in order to reserve that right. And you also have to then give them that notice of the properties that we're talking about. But that way everyone knows who's going to still get paid, even though our agreement might have expired. Okay, and so then there's a bunch of other stuff here, and I'm not going to go over this stuff because this is not stuff that we necessarily fill out. It's stuff we need to understand and all of that. But I want to take out the time we have, and I want to switch over to the other form, if that's okay. Before I do that, do you guys have any questions on this form that I can answer? The other two forms will tie into this form. Okay, so then let me go back. And let me go here. Go down here. Okay, so we're going to talk about the notice of broker involved properties. Okay, this is a pretty simple form. Basically, what it says is that it's being provided to you, the buyer, as required by the BRBC agreement, and it's got, their name, broker name, and the dates of the representation period. So when did that BRBC start? When did it end? And it's saying here that it talks about compensation. So there's a couple different options. Let me just go through it real quick. Okay. So this is saying buyer has agreed to pay the broker the compensation provided in that BRBC agreement. If the buyer entered into a contract to acquire a broker involved property within a certain number of calendar days after the expiration. And so that was that line that we just talked about. And broker has provided to buyer a written list, which is what we're going to have right here on number 4. It says, if after cancellation of the BRBC, the buyer enters into a contract to acquire a property that had broker involvement, and broker provided the written list within 5 days after receiving the notice of cancellation. Okay, so this is what it's saying. I kind of screwed that up. Basically, it's saying number A is talking about if our BRBC agreement expires. Number B is talking about if we canceled that agreement early. So in both cases, it's extending our right to receive compensation under the BRBC agreement if we've given them this form and we are still within the right timelines. So A is it expired, B is it got canceled. And then here, again, it talks about, I read it earlier, so I won't read it again, but the definition of what a broker involved property, could be or would be. And then here we would list the properties. And so as we're working with a client, particularly if we have that BRBC agreement, we want to be keeping track of what properties we're, showing them and all the things that meet these definitions up here. And then of course, it'll go onto an addendum if we don't have enough space, or we can just attach a list. Like if we're keeping track of it in a spreadsheet, for example, we could just attach that list. And then it's giving the buyer a notice here that if they if they want to enter into another agreement with another broker, it's advised that they provide this notice to that broker. And if they don't, they might be obligating themselves to pay 2 commissions. And so it's just giving them that. And so this is the official form where you would give the buyer the notice of the broker involved properties. So it's a pretty simple form.
And then you give this if or when your contract runs out, or if it's canceled.
Mm-hmm.
You don't do this right away along with everything. This is
you're going to have the BRBC. It's going to be an agreement. It's doing its thing. You're showing them properties, and then it's either expires or cancels. And then we're giving them within 5 days, we're giving them this notice of the properties. Now, there's
otherwise
a couple
you
scenarios,
have no claim, right?
Or else you have no claim. Exactly. So this saves that claim for you.
Got it.
Do you put 90 days or do you leave that blank?
On the other form, the one that I had just on the bottom of the BRBC, you would put some days in there. Whether that's 30, 60, 90, whatever it is. Yeah, you would want to put some days in there.
365.
The other thing here is, so you have 5 days to submit this to them. I think if it cancels, but if it expires, I think you have to give this form to them as it expires, not 5 days later. And the difference is, if a contract's about to expire, you might not know if something's about to get canceled. So that would be the difference there. Okay. And then the other form that I wanted to show you guys.
What was that form called? Or the number or the
That was the NBIP, Notice of Broker Involved Properties. And then we have the cancellation of buyer representation. Now, this says that it could be canceled by the buyer or the broker. Broker is going to have access to this form. Buyer's not going to have access to this form. So I'm not exactly sure what happens in that situation. But so this is if we're canceling buyer's representation. So this is not just canceling the BRBC. It encompasses canceling the BRBC, but it also is just if we're canceling like Mr. and Mrs. Buyer, we don't have any written agreement, but I've been working with you and I no longer want to work with you. And we're putting in a writing that I'm no longer working with you. And so what you can see here is you list the parties, list the broker and the buyer. And then it says for the purpose of, it says the buyer representation is pursuant to a written or oral agreement. And so obviously, if we're talking about the BRBC, it's a written agreement, right? And we always advise that everything should be in writing, right? But sometimes we start working with a client and there's nothing in writing and it's just oral. So we don't usually see oral on these forms, but this is a case where there is oral. Okay, so this is a notice of cancellation of buyer representation, and it can be canceled by either the buyer or the broker or by both. So it can be one-sided or it can be mutual. And that depends on, what box you sign down below. And then it says if there's a written BRBC, that compensation might still be owed based on that contract, even though we're canceling that contract. And so compensation would still be owed, again, if we fill out that form and we identify what properties that there was broker involvement, and as long as, the dates and all of that line up. By signing in the box below, either the buyer or the broker is giving notice to the other to cancel the buyer representation and terminate their agency relationship, their duties, and their responsibilities with and to each other. And then there's a part down below where we can talk about compensation if there's any compensation still due. As far as the effective date of the cancellation, so if it's oral or if the written agreement is non-exclusive, then the cancellation is either immediately, or if we had put in a number of days in that very first form, the BRBC, then it would be upon that many days after. So if it's 3 days or 7 days or whatever it might be. So that's if it's oral or it's a non-exclusive. If it's exclusive, then there is a 30-day effective date. The cancellation's effective 30 days after the receipt of this notice by either buyer or seller. Regardless of whether it's exclusive or non-exclusive, both parties can instead agree to mutually cancel the buyer representation either immediately or a certain number of days after the last signature. So we have options here. And then let's see, this notice can apply to all properties that are subject to buyer representation, or it can apply only to the following properties. So I'm not sure why you would market only certain properties, but there's that option to do that. And it specifically says the broker will not be the buyer's agent during any negotiation or transaction that results between buyer and the seller regarding any property. So this cancellation is saying, I am no longer representing you, Mr. or Mrs. Buyer, and what you do at this point is you're on your own, is basically what's that saying. And then we talk about compensation. So the written BRBC, the other form, it provides for compensation in the event of the cancellation. So that was outlined on that form. And the buyer agrees to pay broker as specified in that form. It says that broker shall be entitled to compensation for those properties for which there was broker involvement. And that's where we've got to give that form to them within 5 calendar days. Or compensation shall be specified as below, but only if both parties agree to sign. So then, and then we're advising them to get advice from other people. So if only one party is canceling, then only one party needs to sign here. If both parties are canceling mutually, then both parties would need to sign here. So depending on what happens, depends on who signs and where. And then we come down to compensation. So let me see. When we cancel this agreement, and this would have to be, again, agreed to by all parties, are we being paid as was outlined in the BRBC? Are we only being reimbursed for actual expenses incurred? Are we going to receive a referral fee from another broker? Are we going to receive compensation from the seller? Are we going to receive no compensation at all? And then this last one, this is if there was the exclusive buyer representation where we had marked that box where there was no contractual right of cancellation, then we're agreeing to let each other out of that. So that's what that would pertain to, or other. So when we cancel with a buyer, whether it's with the BRBC or not, we have options of what that can look like. And so that's what this form is about.
So I noticed one of the check mark or boxes down there. So if you're in the situation where you were you couldn't work with them anymore for some other reason, and you were handing it off to another agent, you can hand it off to them and still get a referral fee.
Yes.
So you'd have to fill this out in that situation to get the 25% or whatever.
Well, so right here, you're talking about number C. It says broker will receive a referral fee from another broker pursuant to a separate written agreement with broker. So you'd still have to do that referral agreement with the other broker.
Correct.
And when we say broker, broker, like these are all done at the broker level. For all practical purposes, we're talking about us as the agent being paid, but it's done on the broker level. So yeah, so you still have to have.
We're representing the broker, so
yeah,
it's considered us.
Yeah, and that's the other thing too. So like when we're doing some of this and we're agreeing to it, our broker has to agree to it as well. I mean, we sign contracts on behalf of the broker all day long, but at the same time, if the broker is not okay with us like going after somebody or whatever the case might be, it is the broker's got the final say on this. So yeah. So anyways, that's that form. Honestly, I had not ever looked at this form before last night. So I thought most of you probably hadn't either. So I thought I would bring it and show it to you. Any questions? I know we talked about the buyer rep agreement, the broker compensation. We talked about the notice of broker involved properties. We talked about the cancellation of buyer representation, whether that's through the BRBC or not. Any questions on any of that stuff?
Which is the agreement that is less easy to cancel, or is more, it has more issues to be canceled?
I don't know about
like the exclusive.
The exclusive is more restrictive to the buyer than the non-exclusive is. Okay. So, but when we're talking about canceling them, they would both get canceled with this other form. It just all depends on which boxes, you're checking depending on what agreement you have. Mm-hmm. And hopefully we're not getting to the point where we're, canceling agreements with buyers and whatnot. I mean, sometimes that stuff happens, but I've never, you know, in all my years, I've never had to use this form, but it's good to know that it's here in case I do need to use it, right?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
So,
And do you have to write the reason?
no, it did not ask for a reason there. My guess is that you would have some sort of verbal conversation where you know, both determined or one of you guys determined that you're wanting to cancel the agreement, and then it would get, you know, it would get written at that point. So,
Okay, thank you.
Lori,
but
I
you
have
know,
to bounce. Thank you.
okay,
I gotta go to my
yeah,
next meeting. Okay.
absolutely.
Right.
I was by Ernie. I was just going to summarize here. So again, I'm just showing you the form and the options for how to fill it out. You guys want to discuss with your broker, make sure you know how they want you to fill it out. We are a reputation-based business, so we don't want to be going after buyers for compensation if we're being paid for, you know, by the seller side, but we are also in a changing environment, and who knows, you know, a year from now what real estate compensation is going to look like. And so again, under the direction of your broker, I just showed you how to look at the forms and how to fill them out. All right, well, thank you guys. I appreciate you guys being here, and I will see you guys next time, whenever next time is.
Thank you, Lori.
You're
Thank
welcome.
you.